Macedonia, a young Balkan republic that is a combination of both Orient and Occident, and with a long history. With ancient excavation sites, Byzantine churches, primeval nature, and beaches that are perfect for bathing. A small state that has inherited three unique cultures. Skopje, capital of Macedonia and located in the Vardar River Valley, with a dramatic history that spans many thousands of years. It forms the junction of two trading routes in Southeast Europe that unite both Western and Eastern civilization. The legacy of Ottoman times is omnipresent here. One of the city's most well-preserved mosques is that of the Gazi Aziza Bey Jamia. In the 17th century, it's believed that there were up to 120 mosques in Skopje. Ottoman rule began in 1392 and lasted for 520 years. The city became known as Uskub. The Ottomans introduced the Islam religion and built mosques, enclosed bazaars, and clock towers. This mosque with a double dome once served as a monastery for a dervish order. The old bazaar is an important meeting place. A number of the market streets are roofed. Today, goods are traded, but in former times, many of them were also made here. The products were created on each floor. Fresh fruit and vegetables are in much demand, and the merchants proudly present their goods according to Ottoman tradition. A feast for the eye. But when the muezzin calls for prayer, the people stop what they're doing and pray. Beyond the bazaar is the splendid Audzia Jamia, also known as the colourful mosque. It's surrounded by a stone wall and cemetery. Within one of the tombs lies the remains of city treasurer Ishak Beg. The interior contains little decoration, as in 1689 almost everything was destroyed by fire. The colourful tiles on the external facade were badly damaged. However, the mosque survived and is today visited by the faithful. Caravanserais, baths and mosques were very important in Ottoman times and were always to be found together. Both travellers and traders required accommodation as well as storage rooms, baths and places of prayer. Of the city's three caravanserais, Kosyumli-An is the most impressive. Arcades on two levels frame an inner courtyard and fountain. Today, the caravanserai is used as a lapidarium for the neighbouring National Museum. Roman and Hellenistic artifacts are exhibited in the atrium. Between the mosques is the last surviving monastery in the centre of Skopje, Sveti Spas. Both monastery and church were built before Ottoman times and eventually had to be reduced in size because no other religious building was allowed to be larger than a mosque. In the monastery's courtyard, a stone sarcophagus contains the remains of revolution leader Goce Delchev. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the church was refurbished. Three of the country's most famous woodcarvers worked for 6 years on its splendid interior. The work on the 10-metre wide and 6-metre high icon is thought to have been one of the greatest achievements of that time. a unique work of art. In an adjoining museum, images on the theme of freedom fighting are exhibited. Opposite the old Lower Town is the new Upper Town, the modern district of the Macedonian metropolis. Most of the government offices, shopping centres and hotels are to be found in the southern part of the city. The train station clock is a reminder of a devastating earthquake that occurred here some years ago. A simple monument to Mother Teresa stands in front of her house that, although modern, is also very much in Macedonian style. The world-famous Catholic nun was born in Skopje in 1910. Her whole life was dedicated to the poorest of the poor. The charitable missionary of Grace died in 1997 in Calcutta. The historic stone bridge of Kameni Most spans the river Vardar and unites two city districts and also the Muslim world with that of the Christian Orthodox. The massive 214-metre-long stone bridge was built in the late 15th century under the rule of Sultan Mehmed II, the Conqueror. Next to the stone bridge lies the pride of Skopje, the Stone Bridge Hotel, featuring unique architecture and abundant luxury. Here, the past meets with the present. There's also a square and modern shopping streets. Next we return to the Muslim old town of Kashia, to the largest hammam in the Balkans. The Dalpashin hammam was built in the 15th century. It's a typical bathhouse that dates back to the time of Turkish rule. Where today works of art are exhibited, in former times there were once various bathing rooms divided between men and women, with hot steam and cold water. Kale, an Ottoman fortress, dominates Skopje and the Vardar Valley. Prehistoric settlements that date back to 3500 BC were discovered on this hill. The Illyrians built the first fortress here, and next it was used by the Dardanians, and finally by Tsar Samuil, who ruled the country from here. Earthquakes frequently destroyed the city's fortress. In 518 AD the first time, and in 1963 the complex that had been rebuilt under Justinian rule. But with international aid, the city was eventually rebuilt. Nightlife flourishes here, especially in the southern part of the city. Skopje is once again a city of various cultures. The city's people try to forget. They take pride in the many monuments that feature the famous people who have conquered, defended, and rebuilt their city. The city has survived, and its people have retained their courage. Skopje has become a symbol of fraternity and solidarity, a prospering city at the southeastern end of the world. A popular destination for the people of Skopje is the Matka Valley, a deep canyon that contains the Treska River that was dammed to become a lake. Once hardly anyone visited this wild landscape because there was little to do. Here, a hole in the rock wall leads to the Vrelo cave system. It contains two caves, one above the water level and one below, plus a small lake. Exploration of the cave system is still underway, but it's estimated that it's more than 500 meters deep. By boat, we travel back to visit the canyon's monasteries. Near the village of Glumovo is the Bogorodice Monastery, founded during the 14th century, and active again today, with several monks. The medieval frescoes on the walls and ceilings are well preserved after 500 years. This is due to the special painting methods of that time. The Sveti Nikola Zizevsky Church is situated on a plateau high above the Treska River and surrounded by a small fruit garden and basswoods. The old church was once part of a monastery of the same name. No details exist of its origin, but it was first recorded in the 17th century. The small rock plateau of Sveti Andreea near Matka was originally situated about 20 meters above the river. The church was built in around 1400 AD by Andrea, brother of the legendary King Marco, and 150 years later it was extended. Its frescoes date back to the 15th century. Southeast of Skopje is the little village of Veljusa, whose monastery is well worth a visit. The monastery's Sveta Bogorodice Milistova Church is dedicated to the merciful Mother of God. Its interior is a splendid work of sacred art. In 1080, a monk, Episcope Emmanuel, began its construction. For some years, the church was independent. Here, the frescoes are of two different periods and of remarkable quality. Particularly striking are the motifs of Christ and devils in hell. They reflect the belief of that time that was full of both fear and devout faith. Illustrated language was the most important method by which to communicate knowledge to the simple people of that time. Around Skopje are several monasteries, but the most popular is situated in the small village of Neretzi. The Sveti Panteleimon Monastery is famous for its frescoes that date back to the 12th century and adorn the church. They're in the style of the late Italian Renaissance. Again and again, new frescoes have been painted. In 1926, further frescoes were discovered and exhibited to the public. The monastery church is only used for special occasions such as festivals and weddings. The monastery buildings have been transformed into an hotel. Here, cultural treasures have been saved for modern times. Tetovo in the north and at the foot of the Sar Mountains is the 6th biggest city and also a kind of capital of Macedonian Albania. The so-called Colourful Mosque, or Pasha Mosque, was rebuilt in 1833 by Abdurrahman Pasha and Recep Pasha. Father and son, they were the protectors of the city during the rule of the Ottoman Empire, and their families were in power for almost 120 years. The colourful mosque is a square building 10 metres long with fine decorations of Baroque and neoclassical Ottoman design. Decorations with geometrical and floral motifs, and very colourful, hence the name of the mosque. When in 1495 the mosque was erected at the beginning of Ottoman Turkish rule, many Orthodox Christians inhabited the city. Tetovo became a trading centre and began to expand. Mosques, baths and markets originated, and the new Islamic influence began to manifest itself. The splendour of the mosque with its wall and ceiling paintings was an amazing sight, and several balconies also adorned its interior. Since then, the Imam has been preaching Friday prayers from the end of the minbar staircase alongside the mihrab. Sveti Joachim Ozorgovski, close to the city of Kriva Palanka in the extreme northeast of the country, is the most popular monastery in Macedonia. The large monastery contains 2 churches, several guest houses, and a restaurant. Sometimes there's little sense of peace and contemplation here. Joachim Ozorgovski was one of the men who in the 10th and 11th centuries withdrew into various caves in order to contemplate. He worked wonders and healed people in the name of God. He was thus very popular with the local people. "50 years after his death, Joachim appeared in a dream to a monk named Theophan and instructed him to build a monastery here. Since then, this holy place has been worshipped in by both Muslims and Christians alike. The bones of St. Joachim are contained here. Stip has always been the most central and important city of East Macedonia. It all began with the Isar fortress, whose remains dominate the city right up to the present day. The Romans settled here and built 2 walls up to 19 meters high and named their new town Astibo, Town of Stars. Built in 1332, Sveti Archangel Mikhail Church is situated halfway between the city and its fortress. It's been completely renovated. On the banks of the Otinia River is the small, modest Sveti Spas Church, whose well-preserved frescoes date back to the 14th century. The semi-darkness of the western vaults contains the remains of many original works of art, images of saints and Bible scenes. Truly fascinating. The majority of the wall paintings date back to the 16th century. Sacred medieval art that has withstood the centuries. In the 2nd century BC, Stobi was the largest city in the northern section of the Roman province of Macedonia, although it was settled in much earlier. Philip V recognized its strategically favorable location a century prior to the arrival of the Romans. The junction of the rivers Crena and Vardar created a natural border. When the Romans arrived, the settlement grew into a large city. It prospered due to salt that was transported here from the Aegean coast. Stobi even had its own coinage, the Municipium Stobensum. It also boasted all the comforts of a Roman city: huge bathhouses, floor mosaics, well laid out streets, a water supply, and good drainage. With the arrival of Christianity, the city became a bishop's seat. There followed several invasions by the Goths. But the end of the city's high season came with the earthquake of 518 AD. Within the mountain landscape of Makedonski Brod is the village of Zrica and the monastery of the same name, on a plateau above a perforated slope. Complex with more than 30 buildings, water tanks, and ancient monks' caves, where once peace with God was both sought and found. In the 14th century, a German monk built a new monastery above a previous monk settlement. The frescoes in the interior of the main church were created by artists Dragoslav and Dobroslav. Legend has it that the icons of Mother Mary and Jesus were originally in different positions, but Maria appeared in a dream and ordered the abbot to place them correctly. Over the centuries, new churches were built and frescoes created. Despite hostilities, pillaging, and general destruction, the Zrica monastery managed to survive. In the 4th century BC, at the time of Alexander the Great, vines had been cultivated in the Tikves Valley, south of Veres, and to as far as Demir Capua. When the Turks arrived, the cultivation of vines was permitted, but the processing of grapes took place behind monastery walls. Each year, the largest wine producer grows 30,000 tons of grapes within an area of 100,000 square meters. Several hundred workers produce 25 different varieties of wine that are exported worldwide. In northern Pelagonia is the town of Prilep, well known for its marble and tobacco. The town centre looks like an old, well-preserved Turkish town. The clock tower next to the remains of a mosque overlooks everything. In 1858, it was built on the site of a wooden tower. Since time immemorial, marble has been mined in the surrounding picturesque mountains. The city's second most important product is the heavy Macedonian tobacco that has grown around Prilep. The harvested tobacco leaves are dried out in long garlands and then pressed and packed for delivery. In the mountains on the edge of the city is a sacred gem. The Vrosh Monastery of the Archangel Michael is located amid rocky terrain, beneath the fortress ruins of legendary King Marco. In the 10th century, a monastery tradition originated here, when a stranger from Ohrid came to live an ascetic life within the rocks. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, the main church was rebuilt, as proven by its old frescoes. It had been destroyed but was rebuilt shortly after. The spiritual and cultural history of this place that is dedicated to the Archangel Michael covers more than 1,000 years. He was God's commander, the fierce hero of heaven, and guardian against Satan. The power of this sacred place has helped the people of this region to survive. From each of the monasteries in the surroundings of Prilep, Treskivec is one of the most mysterious. It lies on a tiny plateau surrounded by huge rocks. In the 13th century, the monastery was built on the foundations of an ancient Roman city fortress at an altitude of over 1,000 meters above sea level. During communist rule, the monastery was abandoned and fell into oblivion, but today monks live here once again. Within the monastery's Sveta Bogorodice church are several cultural treasures. The church was built in the 14th century on the site of an old basilica. Many of its frescoes date back to the 16th century. The typical greenish hue of the faces indicates Macedonian artists rather than Greek. A stone baptismal font and various other finds that date back to Roman times are exhibited in the monks' dining hall that is situated behind heavy wooden doors. Southwest of Prilep is the ancient city of Stibira that is also known as Macedonian Pompeii. It's in a good location on an important road. The last Macedonian king, Perseus, had his military headquarters here during his struggles with Rome. He lost, but Stibira eventually grew into a town. It's believed the hostilities with the Goths brought about its end. Krushevo is the highest lying of all Macedonian cities, and famous for its riots against Ottoman rule in 1903. Nowhere else are there so many museums and monuments that are so clearly Macedonian. This city also features the country's most well-preserved old buildings that are painted in traditional yellow and light blue. The famous Krushchevo villas resemble the buildings in Ohrid. No wonder it's so popular with the tourists. Macedonia is the name of an unusual monument on Gumanya Hill, high above the city. Here, builders Jordan and Iskra Grabul unite Macedonian history with the present day. In the extraterrestrial-looking memorial hall, the struggle for freedom is told in a modern way, via Macedonian history. The colourful windows are a reminder of traditional Macedonian carpets. And the four open windows of the country's previous division. In the south, just a few kilometers from the Greek border, is Bitola, at the foot of Perista mountain, and on the edge of the fertile Pelagonia plains. Buildings with neo-Baroque and Renaissance facades, huge mosques and splendid diplomatic residences indicate the city's importance. Bitola has a glorious past, of which its inhabitants are justifiably proud. In the 7th century, Slavs settled here. The city grew rapidly and became the third largest in the Balkans. Finally, the Ottomans made it an administrative and cultural center. As Christianity spread, many churches and monasteries originated around Bitola. Sveti Demetria is the biggest and most important of the city's churches. For many years it was the largest in the Balkans. It dates back to 1830 and its interior is dominated by a splendid two-tiered icon. The contrast of the church's modest exterior to its splendid interior could not be greater. The Renaissance did not develop further under Ottoman rule. Near to Bitola is the ancient city of Heraclea Lyncestis, a typical Roman-Byzantine excavation site with a long history. In around 4500 BC, the Lycestris tribe settled here. In 500 BC, Philip II of Macedonia founded the city. Finally, the Romans created an important center on the Via Egnatia, a splendid city with an amphitheater and many typically Roman buildings. Heraclea had its high season during the 4th and 5th centuries. It became an early Christian bishop's seat and basilicas were built. The wealth of its citizens is indicated by the abundant decoration of the buildings. In the basilicas and bishops' residence, the artistic floor mosaics have been extremely well preserved. When the Roman Empire collapsed, Avares, Goths and Huns raided the city that was finally destroyed by an earthquake. Because his mother was Macedonian, a memorial was built here for Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder and first president of the Turkish Republic. Prespa Lake is located at an altitude of 850 meters above sea level and is surrounded by unspoiled nature. The Garachica Mountains separated from the lower-lying Ohrid Lake. Although large sections of the lake are protected, there are also beaches for those who want to take advantage of the local modest infrastructure. However, it probably won't be too long until the usual tourist hustle and bustle finds its way into this place and gets in the way of its natural beauty. On the opposite side of Prespa Lake is the small village of Kurbinovo that features the Svete Georgia Church that dates back to the 12th century. During restoration work in 1958, well-preserved frescoes from the time of the church's origin were discovered beneath numerous wall paintings. They are highly elaborate and feature the life of Jesus, the 12 Orthodox festival days, and the life of Saint Georgie. Ohrid and the lake of the same name are situated in the southwest of Macedonia. The pearl of all Macedonian towns has a long and colourful history. And narrow alleys, traditional architecture and an amphitheatre are each part of that history. In the centre of the old town, Sveta Sofia was the cathedral of the bishop's seat in the 4th century. At that time, Ohrid was located in the Via Egnatia. The town became the centre of Orthodox Christianity in the Balkans, and a large number of churches and monasteries were built here. The Sveta Bogorodica Perevlepta Church is situated on a hill in the old town. Missionaries Clement and Naum came here in 885 AD. Clement became Bishop of Ohrid and founded the first Slav academy. His final remains were kept here, surrounded by frescoes that date back to the great age of Byzantine art. Next to the church is Ohrid's famous icon gallery that contains exhibits from the 11th to the 19th century, including the images of St. Clement and St. Naum. The National Museum was owned by a wealthy family of merchants. The Ohrid building features exhibits from Roman times until the recent past. Antique coins, ceramics, jewellery, sculpture and wood carvings. At the end of the 10th century, Samuel made himself Tsar and Ohrid became the temporary capital of his newly founded realm, with a fortress and massive city walls. The Svete Panteleimon Church was later destroyed by the invading Ottomans, but several works of art and the bones of St. Clement are still to be found here. Recently, the basilica was rebuilt and the remains of the original buildings are open to the public. such as the grave of St. Clement, as well as the artistic floor and wall mosaics. The splendor of the priceless objects makes it easy to understand why this area has been designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. There are around 365 Orthodox churches in the area of Ohrid town and lake, one house of God for each day of the year. This treasure trove of Byzantine art and architecture is the birthplace of Slav Christianity, as is this small church. It is also called Sveta Bogorodica, like many others, and features ancient frescoes that have withstood the centuries. Even rock churches, such as that of Sveti Anasia, feature precious frescoes on both walls and ceilings that were created by unknown artists. These images depict religious history and the holy men of bygone times. The many different frescoes and icons of the Archangel Michael are among the most valuable treasures of the church of the same name. The Glagolitic alphabet was developed, a forerunner of today's Cyrillic alphabet. Our journey leads further south. The crystal clear Lake Ohrid is one of the oldest inland lakes on Earth. On the banks of the lake, within the Mavrovo National Park, is the almost 1,000-year-old Sveti Jovan Bigorski Monastery. It is a highlight of Macedonian monastic culture, with colourful frescoes whose abundant style features the Byzantine painting tradition of the Middle Ages. Saints and prophets were popular motifs that cover both walls and ceilings, and also scenes from the Old and New Testaments. And Jesus is featured in many variations. Located in unspoiled landscape, Lake Ohrid is almost 300 meters deep at its deepest point. The spire of Sveti Nikolai emerges as if from out of the water, and above there's a rainbow. The Sveti Erasmus Church is dedicated to Christian missionary Erasmus of Antioch, who worked here at the end of the 3rd century. A cave church and wall paintings are examples of an early Christian Ohrid. The banks of the lake were settled here in ancient times, and the almost untouched surroundings are a wonderful sight despite tourism. The well-maintained Sveti Bogorodica Zaumska church dates back to the 14th century. It nestles on a steep mountain slope. Caesar Gregor had it built for Gregorius von de Vol, one of the most influential men of his time. This natural, wild landscape made it possible for the monks to lead a Christian life isolated from the outside world. In around 900 AD, a missionary, Naum, had this monastery built at the southern end of the lake. It's named after him. He was also a teacher and healer. He is said to have healed the insane and those who were plagued by demons. The monastery was destroyed by the Ottomans and in the 16th century was rebuilt. About 100 years later, the first richly decorated icon was created, and in around 1800 AD followed the first frescoes. The churches and monasteries of Ohrid look like something straight out of a fairy tale kingdom. Yet they're the original witnesses of Orthodox Christianity in the Balkans. Once a year, the village of Galichnik comes to life. Every 12th of July, it shines out in full splendor and attracts thousands of visitors from all over the world. The famous Galichka wedding that takes place at Petrovden, the day of St. Peter, is celebrated by one and all. The evening before starts with a torchlight procession and lively dance. The following morning, the wedding day, the villagers walk through the streets in their colourful traditional clothing, past the many visitors who come to experience the event. Music accompanies them on their way along steep steps to the bride's family. A group photograph with the bride, her parents and sisters. After a lively circle dance, the merry village community moves on. Next, they make their way to the groom. An ancient ritual begins. Shaving is a sign of maturity and separation from the parents. The hair is collected in a cloth and is believed to bring good health and fertility. Wearing a hat, the groom is well presented and shows himself to his friends and those who have come to witness the ceremony. Then he rides a white horse through the mountain village, accompanied by a drumbeat and flutes, plus the whole village community. Now more men on horses appear accompanying the bride, who is covered with a veil and riding a white horse. She must not fall off, otherwise it could bring bad luck. In former times, the men of Galichnik went away to earn their living. Once a year, they returned and married. The ceremony has become a popular tourist attraction. Both bride and groom finally meet, and together they enter the church. The wedding ceremony begins. After many prayers, the priest consecrates the rings, and they are placed on the fingers of the happy couple, now husband and wife. In former times, it was a mass wedding, today an ancient tradition. A committee selects a couple who is willing to wed according to time-honored tradition. Outside the church, couples in traditional clothing form a circle in the middle of which are frantic drummers. The young wife fills water from a village well into a metal can and wets her husband's hands with fresh water. Each ritual is accompanied by singing, dancing and drumming and lasts for no less than 2 days. A memorable adventure indeed. The Garlichka wedding is a fine example of colourful tradition and local culture. Here, our journey through one of the last little-known countries of Europe comes to an end. A wild land full of natural splendour, with a long and dramatic history.